Amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chair, I also have an amendment that's not listed at the roster.
Chair recognizes Mr. O'Rourke.
Mr. Chairman, I also have an amendment not listed at the roster and would like to offer that amendment at this time.
Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4228, offered by Mr. O'Rourke.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. O'Rourke is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I appreciate this. The amendment that I'm offering, O'Rourke 52, would simply and very simply address civil liberties concerns that we have with the amount of money and law enforcement resources that are present, especially along our borders with Canada and then disproportionately our border with Mexico. This amendment was offered late. For that, I apologize. It's not as deliberate a process as I think we'd ideally have. But as I pointed out, it's a very simple amendment. And what it does in this multi-year acquisition process that's mandated in Chairman Duncan's bill, we insert a paragraph that is titled Civil Liberties Protections. And it's brief. I'll read it for the committee. This would require an assessment of ways the Department can better integrate consideration of civil liberties implications into the acquisition process for technologies and assets that the Secretary seeks to deploy to ensure that the least intrusive available option that meets the needs of the Department is identified and that other safeguards identified by the Chief Privacy Officer are integrated into the acquisition to protect civil liberties. I'll remind the committee that just between Brownsville and San Diego, the 2,000-mile that joins us with the country of Mexico, 6 million of our fellow U.S. citizens live, and they are subject to unusual police powers employed by the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection officers. And while we acknowledge that and to a degree accept that as a price of living on the border, we want to make sure that we do everything in our power to protect those citizens' civil liberties, their constitutional protections, and their privacy. At a time when we're spending $18 billion a year to secure and defend this border, I want to make sure that there's the appropriate oversight, accountability, and transparency in this very important area. We all care about the Constitution, everyone on this committee. We all care about the Bill of Rights and our civil liberties. We want to make sure that they're protected and enforced everywhere in the United States, including at our borders where so many of our fellow U.S. citizens live. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I look forward to hearing any discussion or suggestions from my colleagues on the committee, but that is the gist of the amendment that I offer.
Any further discussion of this amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Duncan is recognized.
I want to thank you, and I want to thank the gentleman from Texas for offering the amendment. His continued interest in protecting civil liberties is something that I share with him. I've been very vocal in this committee about my stance on civil liberties. I just don't believe that this particular bill and this amendment at this time is appropriate. But I will offer, because I do believe that the gentleman has hit on a point that we need to work on, and I will commit to continue our oversight function and find a oversight hearing within our subcommittee where we can bring in the Department of Homeland Security and talk with them about those very issues that you raise. And so I would request that the gentleman withdraw his amendment and make that commitment to him as we look at civil liberties issues within the Department. And with that, I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Perry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just curious about the term acquisition process, and I, like you, am exceptionally concerned about the civil liberties issue regarding DHS, and I think you've probably been around when I've asked questions about the use of drones and the purchase of said drones and so on and so forth. But I'm concerned in this regard regarding the acquisition process as this amendment relates to, should DHS have the most appropriate tools to enforce the law? And I think we would both agree that they should, but when they use which tool they have is probably more the question than do they have all the tools at their disposal. And this amendment to me seems to say that they should consider civil liberties in the tool selection, not in the tool application, when I think it's the application. I mean, tool selection is certainly an issue, as you know, with me, but I think there's a different criteria to determine whether they have a need or not for that tool not only civil liberties, but capacities and utilization and shared agreements and so on and so forth. So I think it's well-meaning, but I'm concerned that we're hamstringing the folks that we want to enforce the law by not allowing them to get the tools that they need, when the discussion really should center around the application of said tools and which one they use at which particular time. I mean, I'm happy to hear your comment.
Will the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
I agree with your concerns. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that we can be judicious about how we apply potentially invasive technologies, and we can also do the necessary work up front to understand how technologies that we may purchase might potentially harm those that we're trying to protect, might be invasive of their privacy, might conflict with the Constitution and our commitment to protect people's constitutional rights and civil liberties. And so before we spend $1 billion on an integrated system of monitors and towers and cameras and sensors, before we buy software or implement processes that obtain fellow citizens' personally identifiable information, let's do the work up front to understand what those implications are, what some of the unintended consequences of having that information. There was a border security expo recently in Phoenix where contractors are selling to the Federal Government and to DHS. There was, for example, on display for sale barrel cactus that have cameras hidden within them. And that may or may not be a good technology, but how far into the interior of the U.S. will those camera-hiding cactuses be placed? What will they be able to pick up? How will that information be used? That may well be the best technology. Our amendment simply asks that we look at these potentially unintended consequences and make the purchase that meets the security goals of the Department of Homeland Security in the least intrusive manner possible. And with that, I yield.
Will the gentleman yield? I share their concern when you're talking about the use of UAVs and flying over U.S. homeland in this effort to secure our country from those that may enter illegally. What other incidental information are they picking up? What are they seeing? Who has access to that information? But I understand that the department has a privacy department, an office, and they also have procedures. And so I think that the better way to make sure the department is applying this in the acquisition process and systems going forward is to actually have the oversight hearings where we bring that person into this committee and we ask them the direct questions to waylay our concerns or at least give us avenue to address those concerns in other ways. And so although I share your concerns, I just don't believe this is the right time. And I think Mr. Perry raises a good objection. So I commit again. Let's do it the right way. Let's have the right oversight hearing. Let's ask the right questions and see if there is a concern or if our concerns are validated. And if they are, figure out a way we can make it better, not just mudding up an acquisition process. With that, I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment? The ranking member is recognized.
I think Mr. O'Rourke's amendment is forward-looking. And if I hear what the chairman is talking about with hearings, and if by chance we're not to the floor within time that we get the hearing, we might can include the language in some rule, manager's amendment from the Rules Committee to kind of include the civil liberties. And I think if we can get a hearing within a reasonable period of time, we might can facilitate that. But it is forward-looking. Some of the items Mr. Perry talked about, there's genuine concern on the part of a lot of us about how some of this technology is deployed. And I think that the civil liberties aspect of it is just one of those forward-looking things that the department should be tasked with doing before they make the acquisition and say, here's the plan. So I would support a hearing, but I'd also support the maker of the amendment in making sure that the department in its acquisition strategy is as forward looking as they possibly can be.
Is there any further discussion? Let me just say that I agree with the spirit and intent of your amendment. However, given the lateness of the filing, I am also concerned about, as you pointed out, unintended consequences. I am, as Mr. Duncan, a staunch proponent of civil liberties. As we demonstrated with our cybersecurity bill, there is an office within DHS that deals with this issue, and I want to do this the right way. I don't, least intrusive available option. I don't know what impact that has. You and I coming from border states, I don't know if that would compromise our border security efforts. I don't know the answer to that. We haven't had a time to consult with the stakeholders, to consult with the department on the impact or consequences of this legislation. I do agree with Mr. Duncan. The appropriate route and avenue would be to hold a hearing on this issue so we can get more of these answers to these questions. And I agree with the ranking member as well. So I would ask that the gentleman from Texas entertained the prospect of withdrawing this amendment with the assurance that we will have a hearing on this issue to get to the bottom of it. And I think that's a more responsible way to legislate. And I yield to Mr. O'Rourke.
Mr. Chair, thank you. And I think your objections are all very reasonable and well-founded. And I know that you and the chairman of the subcommittee share this concern about protecting the civil liberties of our fellow Americans. I would only ask for this additional commitment, and that is that we have the chance, perhaps with yourself and the chairman of the subcommittee, to meet with the appropriate person or people from DHS to understand what the implications of an amendment like this might be. Perhaps in time, should we agree that it's a good idea to offer it as an amendment before it comes to the floor, or in some other future piece of legislation. And if you would be willing to make that commitment, I'd be happy to withdraw the amendment as offered.
Well, I'm certainly willing to make that commitment to you personally. I know Mr. Duncan does as well. Is the gentleman willing to withdraw his amendment?
I witdraw the amendment.
Okay. Without objection, so ordered. And I thank you for your consideration.